the floor is, the recording just started and the floor is yours.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me now? Yes. Okay, so this paper is titled "The Role of the Clusters of Related Industries in the Economic Performance of the Mexican Economy." And the objective of this paper is to determine a statistical robust cluster configuration in order to analyze how these agglomerations can impact or influence the regional and local growth. So what we do, we follow the methodology of Delgado, that she uses a broad range of using a broad range of activities in the Mexican economy, and we perform based on this framework of the clusters configuration. We use 3 analytical exercises for disentangling how these agglomerations could be influencing the local economic performance. In particular, we analyze the geographical distribution of the clusters. Also, we analyze the evolution of the cluster employment concentrations, and we quantify the cluster spillover effects. In the overview of the results, we found 24 clusters of related industries with a widespread presence across the country, and these clusters present high heterogeneity across them. The main contribution of this paper consists on incorporating services activities into the cluster definition for the Mexican economy. Usually, for the Mexican economy, services activities have not been incorporated. So we show that this agglomeration may be leading to some extent the economic growth of the municipalities across the country where they are present. Basically, we identify 4 clusters with a relatively high direct and indirect spillover effects in the economy, and these are plastic products manufacturing, retail and eating services, food and beverage manufacturing, and automotive. I will skip this part, but basically I will say that the literature about methodologies for the construction of cluster configuration is relatively scarce. We have some seminal papers, for example, the Fesser and Bergman in 2000 that show different methodology, or in that time an innovative methodology for constructing clusters, and later Fesser in 2005 follows the input-output relationship to construct these clusters. And finally, this methodology of Delgado in 2016, as you will see, incorporates a lot of relationships for the construction of the clusters. In the case of Mexico, for example, we have a scarce literature for studying this topic. We have 4 papers here. So in terms of the methodology, I can say that we follow the methodology of Delgado that define a statistical robust cluster configuration. And basically, the most important advantage of this method is that evaluates different possible arrangements of cluster generated based on the scores, and this allowed us to rank the clustering configurations. Basically, in most of the methodologies that the different authors have followed, there is not a unique definition of the clusters. Depending on the criteria that they are using, they will have one configuration. So this is the main challenge in this kind of literature. So the important, or also another important element that is that this methodology also includes an expertise evaluation in terms to have a robust cluster configuration. So this method, widely speaking, has a 5-step method, the steps for finding the optimal configuration. And the main idea of this methodology is to capture the multiple types of relationships between the industries that we are studying. So in the first step, we are using a similarity matrices. In particular, we use 5 similarity matrices that allow us to capture the different relationships between the industries that we are studying in different dimensions, considering the establishments, the employment, or the inputs-output relationships. The second stage is the parameter selection for example, for the clustering. We set up some parameters of the number of the beginning number of the cluster for constructing the clusters, and then later we use the clustering. In the next step is to set up the clustering function. In this case, we also use the hierarchical clustering that has been used for a lot of authors in different papers. So in the part of the performance scores, we have to perform. We have to construct a score that allows us to rank these clusters, these many different clusters. So we can have a statistical procedure to rank them and to select the best configuration. And finally, we perform a final assessment using the expertise of some people that knew very closely this configuration and allow us to have the best configuration. So the data that we use, we have mainly 3 types of data. It's important to say that this configuration of cluster is basically based on the economic census 2019, which is the last one. But also we use for other purposes. We also use the economic census of 2004, 2009, and 2014. So the analysis was carried out considering the 4-digit industry level from the NAICS, and we considered 230 industries that account for about 80% of the gross value added. We also use the National Input-Output Account published by the INEGI, which is a National Institute for Statistics and Geography. And this statistic concentrate the information of sales and purchases by industry. This is the 24 cluster configuration that we obtain from all these following this methodology. Basically, we have 24 clusters that are widely, very heterogeneous between them. First part, for example, we have this oil extraction cluster that has a huge gross value added per worker. In contrast, we have, for example, this one, which is the retail and eating services. But also we have different concentrations of the employment, establishment and production. For example, some of the clusters that concentrates most of the shares in employment are retail and eating services, plastics and product manufacturing, or food and beverage manufacturing, or automotive. In terms of the establishments, we have also that retail and eating services concentrates about 35% of the establishments, or food and beverage manufacturing about 5%. Also, we have important differences in terms of the production. So in terms of the geographical and regional location of these 24 clusters, we can observe that, for example, some particular states have a strong presence of different clusters. For example, in the north, we have that Chihuahua concentrates, show the presence of many clusters, and also Nuevo León, which is one of the most advanced manufacturing states, show an important presence of this type of clusters. In the part of the north center, for example, we can observe that Jalisco, for example, has an important presence of different clusters, especially in manufacturing and also in services. In the center region, for example, we can observe that Mexico City concentrates the presence of many clusters related with services, and also State of Mexico services, but also in manufacturing. In the south part of the country, of the south region, we can observe some clusters that concentrates a lot of presence of oil production clustering, and also hospitality services and apparel, for example. In terms of the stylized stylized facts. We have that, for example, in high-tech clusters, we have that these kind of clusters, which are semiconductors and electronic components and metal product manufacturing, pharmaceutical, and this one, which is okay, I don't say it because, okay, the automotive, they show a strong presence in the northern states of the country and also in the border cities, which is an important fact because we have a lot of similarities and synergies with this kind also of industries that are in the US economy. Okay, so we have another kind of clusters, for example, that they have a wide presence across the country. This is food and beverage manufacturing. We have the tourism and hospitality services, the plastic products manufacturing, and the retail and eating services. And also we have the clusters that we show a higher presence in the big cities, for example, the office and administrative services, education and health services, employment services that are concentrated in the main cities, which are this one, right? And also we have the business support services. Also, we explored the relationship between the growth of these clusters and the growth of the economy at the municipality level. In these graphs, you can see that we can quantify the correlation between the growth of the gross added value of the cluster that is present in that municipality and the growth of the total added value for all economic activities in a given municipality. We can observe that these clusters show a positive relationship between the growth in the cluster and the growth in the economy at the level of municipality. In the first place, we have the retail and eating services, plastic product manufacturing, medical equipment and supplies manufacturing, food and beverage manufacturing, and semiconductor and other electronic components. In this part, you can see, for example, that these two, which is the medical equipment and semiconductors and electronic components, we can see that have a strong relationship, which is positive, but they are composed by few municipalities in comparison with other clusters. So in the third stage of the analysis, we analyze the spillover effects on the economy. For every cluster, we estimate the spillover effects resulting from an exogenous demand shock into dimensions. And we study the direct effects, which are the effects within the same clusters, and the indirect effects, which are the effects toward the rest of the agglomerations in the economy. So we estimate the effects of 1,000 million of pesos in each one of these clusters, and we analyze this kind of, these spillover effects. So intuitively, when a cluster receives a positive exogenous shock, for example, an investment, it creates a direct effect of increased demand within the cluster. And in this case, the magnitude of the impulse completely depends on the structure of the externalities that exist within the cluster. So the initial demand shocks triggers a virtuous circle for higher input demands production, feeding each other after the initial shock. And also in a second step, it creates an indirect effect for the rest of the agglomeration, which in response demand more production from the cluster where the initial shock occurred. So to perform this analysis, we use the methodology of the impact multipliers based in the input-output methodology suggested by Miller and Blay and Torre. This table is how represent the 1 billion peso shock in final demand for the 24 cluster of related industry. It's important to point out that we calculate these effects we translate these effects in terms of the gross production, gross added value, and also the employments. So what we see here is that there are 5 agglomerations with the greatest direct effects in gross production. These are apparel manufacturing, footwear manufacturing, food and beverage manufacturing, plastics products manufacturing, and automotive. In terms of the added value, we identify the employment services and the financial services. In terms of the employment, it stand out the education and health services, retail and eating services, and employment services. Regarding the indirect effects, it's important to mention that the plastic product manufacturing, retail and eating services, and food and beverage manufacturing and automotive show the highest indirect effects. So this is a heat map that represents the indirect effects of the gross added value. As you can see here, there are important results. For example, some of the clusters that show the highest indirect effects are the employment services, but also the office administrative services and soap mills and wood preservation. Finally, for concluding, we found 24 clusters of related industries that we mainly based on data from the 2019 economic census, and the geographical distribution of these clusters shows a widespread presence, and they show a high heterogeneity. We find that the manufacturing-oriented cluster have a strong presence in the northern states of the country, and services-oriented cluster are more frequently distributed in the central regions. Of course, the central tech agglomerations as the medical equipment and semiconductors of electronic components are located in the northern states and also in the border cities, and show an ongoing employment concentration, suggesting a strong complementarities and synergies for production with other related industries in the US economy. We identify specifically 4 clusters that show an important indirect spillover effects. These are plastic product manufacturing, retail and eating services, food and beverage manufacturing, and automotive. In terms of the policy, we confirm that the clusters may be influencing the economic performance in some extent across the economy and regions. And in this context, for example, for future agenda research, we can study the effects of the performance of these clusters in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. So thank you. I will hear for your questions.
Thank you very much, Miriam. That was super interesting. So there are no questions in the chat, but we have 5 minutes for questions from the audience. So we have Bruno raising his hand, and then I think I also saw Mateo. Okay, Bruno, you can go.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Miriam. I was like, when you were indicating those industries that you find large spillovers, I mean, some of those are things I think are natural to imagine they have, like food processing, maybe those plastic industries. But I was really intrigued about these retail and food services, because that's not kind of clear to me. Like it wouldn't be like a sector I would imagine there would be these large spillovers. Do you have any? Do you explore that a little bit in the paper? Have some?
Yeah, I mean, in the construction, since we are using the relationships in inputs outputs from the input-output matrix, we are considering this interrelationship. So in terms of these clusters, I mean, the idea that we have is that that link and these spillovers are generated precisely from these relationships. For example, in the past of the food services, and then they are connected with, for example, with a lot of with the food manufacturing. No, they have a lot of connections in this part, but also in the part of the food retailing services. In Mexico, these kind of services are very different from those in the US. No, we have a lot of informal commerce, so that generate another kind of different connections or relationships. So yeah.
Miriam, can I ask you a question? Can you explain
Sure.
a little bit more the demand shock that you used to estimate these spillovers? Sorry that I didn't get it. So if you can explain
Yeah.
a little bit more.
Yes, usually this is an approach based on a input demand frame approach, and usually you suppose an initial shock of, for example, in this case, 1,000 million pesos. Imagine that you receive that investment, for example, in the cluster of the automotive. No, we recently like a couple years ago, Mexico will receive a huge investment in this sector. And this sector experienced a lot of spillovers within the sector, that is the factory of cars, but also impulse another clusters like the plastics, right? Because we need a lot of plastics, we need a lot of aluminum, for example, in the steel cluster, you know. So that's the main idea. In the first part of the mechanism in the channel, you have an initial shock that goes within the cluster, but these industries that are integrating this cluster are also generated an additional demand on other clusters.
I see. I was thinking that you can also use like commodity price shocks because they are usually exogenous because they're like international, like they are like determining the international markets, and that will be like a clear demand shock, and probably that will be uncorrelated with these spillovers, and then it will be like a little bit more exogenous than these investments that you just mentioned. So
Yeah, it's a possibility, and it's possible to do it. We haven't thought in about this dimension. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Miriam. I think now we are right on time for the next presentation by Roman. The floor is yours.
all right. Thank you very much, Antonella, and thank you very much, everyone, for being here. I'm going to present this joint work with Jorge Perez Perez from the Banco de Mexico and Felipe Vial, who is a graduate student at Berkeley. So the title of the paper is Urban Transit Infrastructure, Spatial Mismatch and Labor Market Power. So what are we going to do in this paper? We're going to relate to this economic geography literature that has a focus on understanding what are the economic consequences of infrastructure expansions on labor market. Now, how are we going to do it? We're going to leverage a large expansion of the subway system in Santiago, Chile in the last 20 years. And we're going to estimate a panel event studies with worker and firm fixed effect to obtain reduced form estimates of the impact of receiving access to this new subway network. And then in order to consider not just the direct effects that can arise because of this expansion in the subway network, we're going to propose a commuting model in which firms are going to exert labor market power to conduct welfare calculations. The estimation of the model is still in progress, but we have some simulations that we're going to show you. Our main results are going to suggest that workers are going to start working farther away when they receive access to these new subway stations. But we're also going to find that workers who does not switch jobs but stay at the same job are also going to start earning more. So we think that this is evidence that there is some labor market power in Chile. And then when we calibrate the models and we consider this additional margin of labor market power, the calibrated counterfactual suggests that the welfare gains are amplified by 10 to 20% when we consider these labor market power responses. So in terms of the motivation, labor market integration can work as an additional benefit of infrastructure besides reducing the commuting cost. So before all these spatial models, the traditional approach was to use the formula from McFadden. So this is a cost time saving formula approach in which you just translate the reduction in commuting costs into changes into utility. However, this traditional approach does not consider general equilibrium effects, so that prices can change because of the infrastructure. And second, it must consider these indirect effects that can come from factor allocation. So we consider these two additional benefits. The first one is that this transit infrastructure can improve the match between firms and workers. So that is going to generate some direct efficiency gains by increasing the productivity in the city. And similarly, there are these additional benefits when there is a transit infrastructure. The outside options of workers can improve because now you are going to get access to other jobs. And this is also a threat for employers. So this is also going to be a possibility that can reduce labor market power that firms have over workers. And we're going to consider this margin in our model. And these additional benefits are important to evaluate the cost effectiveness of these transit networks. In particular, when we build an infrastructure, we want to do some cost benefit analysis. And in order to calculate well the benefits, we need to take into account the general equilibrium effects, but also these indirect effects that can come from the outside option of workers. And this question is super important given the rapid urbanization in middle and low income countries that has been going on in the world. Okay, so in terms of the literature, we're going to contribute to 3 different strands of the literature. The first one is the impact of transportation infrastructure. So there are several papers that have estimated like the impact of roads. Antonella is going to show us like a paper in which she shows like there can be some white elephants. And here what we want to like our contribution to this literature is that these transit infrastructures can also lead to indirect gains via this labor market power effects on wages and work location. We also contribute to this spatial mismatch literature. In particular, we show that transit infrastructure can improve the matching between firms and workers. And finally, there is like this new literature of labor market power that has been receiving a lot of attention in the last 5 years. And here what we want to do is that when labor markets get more integrated, this outside option of workers can reduce labor market power. And to do that, we propose a model of commuting and oligopsonistic labor markets, similar to what Berger and co-authors did in the US. Yeah. Okay, so the expansion that we're going to analyze is that since 2004, there has been like a large expansion of Santiago subway network. In particular, like before 2004, there were only like 52 stations. Now there are 136 stations. This represents an increase of 61%. Similarly, like the length of the network has increased for around 40 kilometers to 140 kilometers. This is an expansion of 250%. And of course, this is reflected in the number of trips that you observe daily. The number of trips has increased from 1 million to around 2.5 million. So just to give you an idea of the expansion of the network of Santiago, this is like the transportation network in January 2001. And you will see that in the map, there are going to be new lines and extensions of new lines. So we're going to analyze, like in event studies, these different expansions. So for example, this green line expanded to the east, to the west. There's this new line, this new purple line, this new blue line. The yellow line also expanded. And then there are also other expansions. For example, in January 2012, this other line expanded to the south. And you can go on. So we're going to analyze this in event studies specification using some employer-employee data. So the data that we're going to use is this employer-employee in which they report like monthly earnings. These are going to be top coded, so there is going to be some measurement error for the top percentiles. But we observe this employer-employee data from March 2002 to right now. And then we observe, so something very important about this data relative to previous work that has evaluated transit infrastructure is that we observe like the district of workers' residence, but we also observe like the district of the firm's location. And this is going to be very important for our empirical analysis, but also for the model. Right now, we only observe a snapshot of locations. We cannot see migration in the city, but we are trying to get access to more data to understand migration patterns and how the transit infrastructure changed the household composition in the city. And we also complement this data with origin destination surveys for 2001 and 2012 that we're going to use to compute trial times across the different locations. Now, we run a standard event study specification in which we have like the outcome of worker I living in district D for Monty. And we're going to interact this with a treatment dummy variable that is going to take the value of 1 when the worker gets access to the transport network. And we're going to interact this with time dummies to calculate the event study. Very important, we're going to include a worker fixed effect. So we will be comparing the same worker over time. And we're also going to include like time fixed effect to control for seasonality things. And we're going to cluster our standard errors at the district level. Because you have all these expansions in the city, it is very important to define the treatment. So the way that we are going to define the treatment is that we take a representative sample of work trip origins for each district, and each month we calculate the distance from each point to the closest existing subway station. And when we observe like the biggest change for a district, we say that that district is going to be treated. This is like a very restricted way in which we're defining the treatment. So we are working on defining a continuous treatment, but those results are not available yet. The reduced form results are going to suggest that workers are going to start working farther away and they are going to earn more. But very importantly for our story of labor market power, workers who do not switch jobs but still work in the same firm are going to start also earning more. In terms of the firms, we're going to find that firms start hiring workers that are farther away. And finally, this is related to a trade literature when there is like an integration of markets, prices are going to converge across the space. Here we find like, because labor market is integrating more, we're also going to find that earnings are going to converge across the space. So I'm going to just show you some of these results. So this is the events study for the time to work using the time, using the trial times in the period before the shock, or before the transit network shock. And what we find here is that the time to work is increasing by 1%. So this suggests that workers are starting working farther away from their home. Similarly, in terms of earnings, we find that the earnings of workers that receive the treatment increases by 1% relative to a control group. And we also find like these parallel trends. Now, this is like the second result, and this is like the story of market power. So we run this event study, but instead of just including worker fixed effect, we include worker firm fixed effect. So we will be comparing workers that do not switch jobs before and after the shock. And what we find is very similar result. The coefficient is a bit smaller than the ones that we previously found, but basically earnings increase by 1% for the workers that receive access to a network relative to a control group. And this is evidence that these workers are improving their outside options, so there is going to be a decrease in labor market power as these workers have better outside options. Now, we also use another region as the control group. So there is this region in Chile called the Bio-Bio region that didn't experience the subway network expansion. So we're going to use this Bio-Bio region as the control group, and we're going to stack this difference in difference to avoid that early treated units can be controls for later treated units, given all this new literature of this difference in difference specifications. If there are spillovers within Santiago, this estimate is going to be closer to a pure treatment effect in the sense that there can be some agglomeration spillovers due to a transportation network. And what we find are like bigger results that we previously found. So for the earnings, we found that there is an increase by around 2% when we compare the workers in Santiago versus the workers in this Bio-Bio region. And similarly, for the workers who do not switch jobs, in particular, when we include this worker firm fixed effects, we also find an effect of around 1.5%. So the point estimate is a little bit smaller, but still the workers that do not switch jobs and have bare outside options also experience some gains in their earnings. Okay, so based on that evidence, we build this spatial quantitative model in which firms are going to exert labor market power.
You have 2 minutes, Roman.
Okay, so I'm going to skip very quickly this model, and I'm going to go over like the results of the model. So basically what we do is that we calibrate the model and run the different counterfactuals to understand what is the effect of the transit infrastructure in terms of welfare. But we consider two margins: the margins when we do not incorporate labor market power, so that margin is only going to capture a spatial mismatch, and the margin in which we incorporate labor market power. So the first thing is that depending on some supply elasticity in the model, the response of the average markdown is going to be higher. So when it is easier to substitute employers in the model, then the response of the markdown is going to be higher. Similarly, we obtain that as the response or as the substitutability between employers, as it is easier to substitute employers in the model, when there are these shocks, there is going to be higher increase in labor income, higher increases in aggregate income, and a lower decrease in aggregate profits. Now, the second result is that when we analyze what's the shock, what we're going to find is that markdowns are going to become more concentrated. And because markdowns are more concentrated, the dispersion of the marginal revenue product of labor is going to be lower. This means that there is going to be lower misallocation. So as there's lower misallocation, aggregate productivity increases and welfare increases more than in perfect competition. So what we have here is the increase in welfare versus the increase in welfare competition. And as you can see, depending on this labor supply elasticity across employers, so how easy it is to substitute jobs across employers, the gains are going to be higher. Like, so far, our estimates suggest that this labor supply elasticity is around 8. So what this means is that the welfare gains are amplified from 15% to almost 30% when we include these labor market responses. So it is like 2 times the gains when we include these labor market power responses. So let me conclude. What we have shown is that access to a subway network change workers' workplace decisions, that workers that experience the shock start earning more, even those who do not switch jobs, and that the total welfare gains of these transit infrastructure projects are amplified when we consider labor market power responses. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you very much, Roman.
Sorry that I have to run.
No, you're just on time, perfect for a bit of discussion. I actually have some questions, and I was wondering if you can share your screen of the event study analysis. So,
yeah, sure.
A question I have is if in the event study you are, so essentially, how long does it take to complete, like to construct these subway expansions? And if the year that you're taking is the year in which a subway expansion finished, because I'm trying to understand a little bit what is that counterfactual, like what's going on that year before the 0. And essentially, because an idea I have in mind is that, a little bit linked to my paper, is that if that expansion of subway is generating disruptions, then your counterfactual is actually a year in which there were fewer, like there was less time to work if, let's say, people were taking alternative routes, or because of disruptions, they were just working from home. I don't know, like thinking a little bit of the counterfactual, is it like, or is it just a period in which everything was working as normal, and then comparing that to the subway expansion? And linked to that, I was wondering also about trends. So if you are controlling for years to, because you have a treatment group, you can control for years to the years relative to the subway expansion, right?
Yeah, so okay, so I think that the first question is an excellent point. It's something that we should consider. Right now, the way that we're defining the treatment is just taking like the maximum difference when there is like this new station. So we're calculating like the distance from every district to the new station, and we take like the maximum difference in time between one period and another. So to answer like your first question, we're just taking like the opening of the new stations. We're not taking into account like the time of the announcement, or that there can be some disruption, so that people can be taking alternative routes. So that's something that we're not considering right now. We're just taking as the treatment event dummy the opening of the new station. But I agree with you, it's something that we should consider, and probably like running the event study, not only using the opening of the new station, but also using like the time of the announcement of these new stations. So usually it takes like 4 to 5 years to construct these new stations. So we can take a look at the time of the announcement to see if something happens, and if we find like some effect with the time of the announcement. But we observe like parallel trends here. And the second thing related to your point about like the trends, we're including like the year fixed effect. So if here we're including like month fixed effects or semester fixed effects, depending on the specification that we run. So we're controlling for trends. And in some of our specification, we're actually like interacting the initial characteristics of the districts with this time fixed effect, so that there are going to be specific trends depending on the initial characteristics of the district. So we are taking care of that.
Yeah, my suggestion was just because you have the interaction of T and D, and D is captured by your fixed effects, that T can also be controlled for, because ultimately you want to keep the interaction only, right?
Okay.
Yeah, you can try that.
Okay, that sounds good, Antonella. Thank you for the suggestion.
I think there's also a question here in the chat. So Carlos Mesa, maybe you want to read out loud your question?
Hi, yeah, sure. I was just wondering, yeah, because I didn't get the treatment. Now you explain it a little bit more, but if you may be also looking at potential buffer zones that measure distance within the nearest subway station, because I mean, these new lines tend to cross different blocks within the city. So it changes the distance to the nearest station for people differently across the city. And my second question was that because you're having these changes between the announcement, the time it takes to build, the time it opens, if you have any information on changes of location within the city, of people reallocating maybe to try to compensate for this new infrastructure projects.
Okay, thank you very much, Carlo. Those are excellent questions. So for the first question, like right now, the way that we're defining the treatment, as I mentioned before, is just taking like this distance between the district and the new station, and when we define the treatment when this difference is the maximum in our period of study. So we're not considering right now these buffers. I agree with you that we should define the treatment with buffers. I have a paper in Mexico in which I look at the subway expansion, and the treatment there is just a dummy variable if a new station is within a 15-minute walking distance to the home of the people. So it's definitely something that we should do. Right now, the problem here is that the worker is the one that is treated. So we need to think a little bit more how to define the treatment. We believe that the best way to define the treatment is not using like a dummy variable, but using a continuous variable, which is going to take into account the reduction in the trial time. And we're working in an event study in which instead of using like a dummy, we're just going to have like the trial time. And when we have the trial time, we can define a buffer with the trial time. For example, if the trial time was reduced in 10 minutes, in 15 minutes, or something like that, to define like a treatment dummy variable. So it's definitely something that we should do. And in terms of household reallocation, so far, like in the data that we have right now, we do not observe migration. So we're doing some things to observe migration. So we're trying to get access to more data to know when people relocate from one location to another and observe these migration patterns. But something that we have done is that we have looked at the household composition in terms of characteristics of the individuals that live in these locations, and we have not found a match. So when there is this network expansion, we do not find like effects on, for example, on the skill of high skill, on the high skill share, or on the age of the workers, on the number of kids that there are, and etc. But it's something that definitely we should take a look. Thank you very much for your comments.
Final question, Julian. I think you had your hand raised. You wanna, ask your
thanks.
question.
I have two questions from I'll try to be quick. The first one is, my guess is that the effects are going to be very heterogeneous by income level, right? Because lower income people tend to rely more on public transportation. So my first question is whether you have analyzed that, look at that, whether the effects are higher on lower income areas. And the second question is, how do you deal in your definition of treatment? How do you deal with sort of somebody who's already living close to a subway station is also benefited from the expansion of the network, because now, I mean, he's still close to a subway station, but now the network is larger, so he gets he should get some treatment out of that, even though his distance to a station does not change. How do you think about that or deal with that? Thanks.
Okay, those are like two excellent questions as well. So the first question about the heterogeneous effect, we have looked at effects by gender and we haven't found much. In terms of lower income areas versus high income areas, we have looked at those, but they are not like big heterogeneous effects here. Like the point estimates are very similar across like different groups. Even if we consider gender, if we consider like educational groups, the effects are quite similar. So it is just like 1%, an increase by 1% when the subway network expands. And in terms of the treatment, so again, like we think that we need to refine our definition of the treatment, but the way in which we can control for that is that according to the model, there are some commuter market access measures. So these wage indices over here, it's like it captures like a commuter market access measure, and this commuter market access measures is going to depend on the trial times to the different location, but also on the number of jobs that are in the different locations. So this commuter market access measure, what is going to capture is how good is the access to the different jobs in the city. And we can run like the same difference in difference specification that we have right now with the treatment dummy variables, but instead of using that as our treatment measure, we're going to use like the commuter market access measure. The problem with that is that commuter market access measure is going to capture like long run differences over time. So in order to run that difference in difference, we cannot run the event study. So what we are doing, for instance, to estimate some of the parameters of the model is to estimate that commuter market access measure, but just take like the two differences over time. The difference in 2001 versus the difference in 2020. And that way we're going to capture that some of these households that were already closer to a subway are experiencing an improvement in their access to jobs in the city. So I hope that answered your question, Julian.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Roman. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. There's one more question that Miriam left in the chat, but we don't have time right now to address it because we have to go to the next presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Antonella. I'm going to stop sharing, and thank you very much, everyone, for your comments.
Bruno, it's your time to share your presentation. Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. First of all, thank you all for being here, and it's great to present this paper in such great companion. So basically, to start the motivation of this paper, I think I'll borrow some things from Roman's presentation. So if you look at that subway expansion in Santiago, we see that like it took many years. And so like to build a subway line or like some most large transportation infrastructure projects, it usually takes a lot of time. And we also see there, like in the case of Santiago, that there will be like some lines that eventually get those extensions. And so often what happens is that because we have the transportation infrastructure takes time to build, it also turns out that we will have a gradual opening of a transportation project infrastructure. So segments at each time. And so although this is important, this is something that has been a little bit overlooked in economics, where we most tend to focus on trying to understand the effects of access to transportation. And what my claim here and contribution of this paper is to say that this timing of how this gradual opening occurs is also something that matters and that we should look at when we try to understand the effects of transportation infrastructure projects on the spatial distribution of economic activity. And so to be more precise, what I do in this paper, first, I'll have a highly stylized model of city emergence and growth along a railroad that's being built over time. And I'll be exploiting the fact that if you're building a railroad, there will be many sites that depending on how you're building that, how fast you're building that railroad, these sites may be longer or for less time as an endpoint of that railroad. And in this model, what the main prediction of the model is that if a site, a town, spends more as a railroad endpoint, this town will become persistently larger. And then the main contribution of the paper is to get those predictions from the model and try to look at this in the data. And so be having some railroad towns in Brazil. And basically, I will show that, in fact, we have this association. So what we see in the data is that if a town spent 1 year as an endpoint more in the past, then this town today is 0.11 log points larger. And I'll exploit some asymmetric predictions of the model, some historical evidence and NIV approach to argue that this association is really capturing what will be a causal effect that the model is predicting. So let me start with what will be some of these historical evidence. And so what we see here in this graph is so basically when you have here this horizontal axis, we have the location of different towns that are along this railroad line called Estrada de Ferro Araraquara. So this was a railroad line that was built through over 50 years. And so basically what we see is that this green line indicates the year in which the railroad arrived at each of those towns. And so basically if we see, for instance, for this town, that we have this vertical line, this indicates how many years that town spent as an endpoint. And we also see here in this graph, indicating by those points, the size of these towns in terms of urban population in 2010. And so the first thing we notice is here we see like there is some correlation. Towns that spent longer as an endpoint, they tend to be larger. And there is one particular case that's very interesting, which is relates to this red town called São José do Rio Preto, which was a town that at the moment the railroad arrived there, this railroad company went bankrupt. And then it was acquired by a German firm. Then there was First World War. This German firm didn't have money. There was like a workers' strike. The government decided to take the company back. The company went in court to not lose the concession. And through a lot of things that probably seem kind of random to characteristics of this town spent 21 years as a railroad endpoint. And so let me point out two facts we see here like in this graph. First, this town is today by far the largest along this railroad line. Second, if we look at the distance from São José do Rio Preto to the next town, this is also the largest we see along this railroad line. And so if we look at what some geographers at the time that were documenting this expansion were saying, they were pointing out, yes, being a railroad endpoint was something that would benefit city growth, and those cities would start like getting new business and becoming more economic vibrant. But even after the railroad was expanded, that place was no longer an endpoint. There were reasons for us to expect that endpoint town would persistently be larger. And so this is like a historical example, and so let's try to understand a little bit of why this could happen and what's the logic for why this occurs. And so I have a model in the paper, which I'll not discuss here, but only an intuition of it. And this is a model of city emergence. And so new cities emerge along the railroad line as the railroad line is constructed. And so what happens is, suppose you have a town, and this town is currently the endpoint town. Over time, new businesses are entering, these businesses are becoming more productive, and basically this implies that when the railroad is expanded, for a new town to emerge, the business there must be relatively, they must be able to compete with the businesses from this previous endpoint town. And so this occurs either because they are farther away, so this generates like some costs, that dispersion costs that would allow these other firms to emerge at that particular site. But it also depends on the productivity of the former endpoint town. And so what happens is that if a town spends a longer time as a railroad endpoint, the firms will be more productive when the railroad is eventually expanded. And so this will push the next town farther away by casting this larger agglomeration shadow. So the first prediction the model gives us is that if a town spends more as an endpoint, the distance to the next town will be larger. And as the size of the town will depend on the demand for its urban services, this will depend on the size of this hinterland that the town is serving. And so basically by pushing the next town farther away, we also have that the town will be larger. And let me point out that all this is happening regarding what will happen with the next town to emerge. The previous town to emerge had already emerged, and so there is like some asymmetric prediction of this model that time as endpoint, although it predicts distance to the next town farther down the railroad line, it doesn't predict distance to the town farther up. And so let's bring and try to test this in the data. And what I do is that I collected opening dates for historical railroads in the state of São Paulo. And so what's interesting about this setting is that São Paulo is over here, the city of São Paulo, and beginning in the mid-19th century, there were like all these railroads that were being built toward the west, which was an area that was very sparsely populated. And so many new towns were emerging in this setting. And so basically what we have rough 200 municipalities. Here I will call each of these is what I refer to as a town. And the railroad arrived there in a period of 100 years from 1867 to 1967. And the railroads were all being built towards the west. And so that's the direction of railroad growth. And what we see in this map is in darker shades, we see the municipalities that spent longer as railroad endpoints. So we have some variation across space in terms of how many years those towns spent as railroad endpoints in the past. So basically, what I'll be showing is that I'll be estimating like some version of this model in which basically we have as as our left-hand side variable a measure of city size, mostly the logarithm of urban population 2010. And we see how this is associated with the number of years that town spent as a railroad endpoint in the past. So note that all my sample consists of towns that are at the railroad. So this is our correlation conditional on eventually getting some access. And I'll first show OLS results, and then we will start to think of whether maybe these OLS results might be biased and not reflect the causal effects. And so what I show in the paper is that first, it doesn't seem to be the case that towns that were endpoints for longer are different in a variety of geographic fundamentals than towns that were endpoints for less time. And so there seems to be some balance. And if we control for a very large set of observables, we barely change the results. And so this does not seem to be the story. We'll have like a concern regarding reverse causality, which I will explore, I'll address with an IV approach that I will discuss in a moment. And we also be using these asymmetric predictions regarding the effect on distance to the next town and distance to the previous town to give further support that the associations I document here are likely to be capturing a causal effect. And so this graph here shows like the main results. So what we see here is simply this scatter plot where we have the logarithm of urban population 2010 of these municipalities against the number of years they spent as railroad endpoint. And we see that there is clearly some positive association here. So basically my baseline estimates, we see an effect of 0.11 log points for each additional year as a railroad endpoint. And the results are similar when we look at urban GDP. So if we also look at the other predictions of the model, in particular the other main prediction, which is that the other towns, the next towns will be farther away, we also see here some positive association. So this is in line with what the model predicts. And what I also think it's interesting is what the model does not predict, which is distance to the previous town, is also some association we don't observe. So there doesn't seem to be any association between time as endpoint and distance to the previous town. And so this kind of, I think it's nice because if maybe there will be some other explanations for this positive association between time as endpoint and city sizes, it's not clear why it would drive this asymmetric pattern that we observe here.
Bruno, you have 2 minutes left.
Yeah, this is perfect, thanks. No. So basically, like to wrap up, like what I show so far were these OLS results, and a concern we might have is that there might be some reverse causality that's explaining that. And to understand that, think of that, suppose there is a town, and even despite geographic fundamentals, we think that this town is going to boom and it's going to grow. And the guys at the railroad company, they knew about that. So they have a lot of incentives to connect that town, but they might not have incentives to go farther from it. And so these might generate the type of reverse causality that we should observe the towns that are larger or that will eventually grow more, also the ones where we have longer times as endpoints. So to address that, I use as IV the following variable. For each of these municipalities, let's find what would be the closest municipalities farther down, so places that were not yet connected by that railroad line, that were at the time already incorporated. And by already incorporated, this is probably capturing the fact that those sites, those other towns, they were already relatively sizable. So these were places that the railroad company would have an incentive to try to connect and provide transportation services to. So the IV actually is the logarithm of distance to that closest municipality farther down. So why this IV would matter, why it would be relevant? Because suppose this other town is relatively close, then we'll have some incentives. The railroad company will have some incentives to build faster and reach that particular location earlier, because the cost to build will not be that high. And this is what we'll see in the first stage. The other thing we need to think about is the exclusion restriction. And what happens that this IV shouldn't directly affect the long run city size. And so there might be some concerns here. And so have like some robustness exercises. For instance, the IV is associated with a geographic position. So something I do is that I'll show that the results are very robust and stable to the inclusion of a large set of fundamentals as controls. But also it could be that maybe the fact that this town is relatively closer by might indicate that that town we are looking at, the observation we are looking at, was in the past less remote, and this might have some direct effect. And so what I do in the paper is also to exploit the fact that we're constructing this IV based on distance to the closest town farther down, not farther up. And I show that like if you use it like the town farther up, we don't see any effect. And so this is kind of like a placebo IV. And I won't have much time, but I'll be happy to talk more about that. So just to conclude briefly, these are the two-stage least squares. And so first we see, in fact, the first stage, towns for which the next incorporated municipalities are farther away. They tend to spend more years as endpoints. And when we turn to the two-stage least squares estimates, we find results that are similar. And they're slightly larger, but qualitatively they point in the same direction as the OLS of larger urban populations, larger distance to the next municipality, but it's not clear there is an effect on distance to the previous municipality. So I guess I probably ran out of time, and so thank you all. It's a pleasure to present here.
Thank you, Bruno. You have 3 minutes, around 3 minutes left for some questions. So I'm gonna open up the space for the audience to ask any questions.
I think Roman had raised his hand, right?
I was applauding Bruno.
Oh, okay. Oh, perfect. Thanks.
But yeah, I don't have questions.
Okay.
Okay.
I actually have a question. Like you look at these endpoints, have you looked like where this matters, like the size of the municipality? There is a paper in China that look at the size of municipality when there is improvement in market access. So I don't know if you can do some of these things similar, because I don't know if it matters like the size of the municipality when there are endpoints or not. So
yeah, I think what's nice about the settings that most municipalities, they didn't even exist before. And so I have like some things on controlling for 1872 census information on population sizes and things like that. I didn't try to think of maybe getting some heterogeneity along that. I'm not so sure I'll be able to get much there, but that's, but this is.
okay.
And Mateo raised his hand. Mateo, please, can you ask?
Yes, I have a question. Hi, Roman. I have a question both for Roman and Bruno. Maybe, I don't know if at the end is going to be time for a little bit of discussion or something, but I was kind of trying to figure out over which dimensions are kind of these results generalizable, because, you know, Santiago may be a very different city in some respects, and so an infrastructure project may have different, I don't know, results. And so I guess it's a question more generally about external validity, about how you, both Roman and Bruno, kind of think of your results and over which dimensions do they kind of generalize, and how to think more about this. Now I'm living in Bogota, and it's like a whole different city with different transportation challenges and so on. So I guess it's kind of like maybe for the end, or if there's time now, for kind of help us think through these things.
Okay. Yeah. So I think this is a very important question. Like for this paper I think it's true that I'm looking at a set where we already have this geographer saying these things matter, and so I think it's not any transportation infrastructure project that can have this effect. I think also the model, even though the model is stylized and very specific to this framework, helps understanding a little bit of that. Because what really matters is that when a transportation infrastructure arrives to a place, this place starts growing and casting those agglomeration shadows that prevent economic activity in other nearby regions. And there's like some evidence, like a recent Geo paper by Kuberis and co-authors, like showing that agglomeration shadows were more important in the past than they were more recently. I think the results might be also slightly different depending on the setting. I guess like a urban setting like transit might have like some different effects, but I think this idea of maybe you open like a large business or some concentration of economic activity here, and this is affecting nearby places, and I think this is something that might imply that maybe some other settings we might see something like that. But that's a great question.
Yeah, just to complement what Bruno just has said. So I think that it's difficult to say how the external validity of our results. I do believe that, for example, in my case, labor market power is an issue, and like the evidence suggests that it is a bigger issue in developing countries. So providing workers with better outside options, I think that probably it will reduce labor market power in most settings. But so the model can apply to some settings, but of course it is going to depend on the parameters of the model and on the context in which you estimate those parameters of the model. So for instance, in the case of Chile, we're finding like large differences between these two parameters that determine like the labor market power. But in some cases, it can be the case that the two parameters are close to each other. So there are no differences in labor market power. So I think that this is going to suggest some evidence that, for example, transit shocks can reduce labor market power, but for sure more evidence is needed. And I wouldn't say that these results can be extrapolated to our context as well. So thank you, Mateo. It was a very good questions and very difficult to answer as well.
Great, thank you very much for all the interesting questions. So now is my time. I hope I don't run out of time. I'll try to be fast.
So I'll let you know when you have like 2 minutes.
Perfect.
Time. So that helps.
Thank you. That's very useful. Thank you. So I'm Antonella Bancalari. I'm an assistant professor in economics at the University of St. Andrews and research associate at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. I'm going to be presenting this paper, which I suspect might be the last time I present it. So I think it's special that it is in LACEA. And it's about the unintended consequences of infrastructure development. I hope you can see well the screen. Sometimes people tell me it's all black. Okay, I assume it's all good. Okay, so it has long been accepted that investing in infrastructure is a driver of productivity and economic development. And in fact, just in 2019, the total spending in infrastructure projects in low and middle income countries amounted to about $1 trillion US. Now, there is ample evidence about the effectiveness of infrastructure from projects that are completed and in use. So in the positive side, we know the sewerage can improve once it's completed, can improve public health. Dams, electricity networks, and railroads can improve productivity, reduce poverty. On the negative side, we know that some infrastructure projects like coal plants or irrigation dams can also create some hazards to the local population. But all of these are based on infrastructure projects that are already functioning. But what about the implementation? So it's striking that around 30% of public infrastructure projects are not completed. And thus the returns to these projects of such a large number of projects are stemming only from the implementation phase. Yet we know very little about the effects of infrastructure projects before its completion. And even for those that are completed, we might be over or underestimating the social cost or benefits if the implementation phase is completely ignored. So it's important to consider all phases of implementation and let's say implementation, so before completion, as well as the effectiveness after completion for an accurate cost-benefit analysis of infrastructure. So what I do in this paper is to ask, what are the effects of implementing infrastructure? And I do so in the context of sewerage infrastructure in Peru. And you can see here essentially a picture of how these infrastructure projects are typically developed. This is a picture in Peru in which there are open ditches that get full of stagnant water. There's very little adherence to health and safety guidelines. There's no signaling, and it happens right in the middle of a residential area. So you can start imagining the type of public health hazards that infrastructure projects like that can pose during the implementation phase. So in this paper, what I do is I move the debate from whether or not to invest in infrastructure, if it's effective or not once it's completed, towards the implementation phase to try to understand the returns of this implementation phase. And what I do specifically is I estimate the effects of implemented sewerage projects on infant and under 5 mortality, which are the outcomes that were supposed to be improving, given that they improved in high-income countries in the previous centuries. And what I use is data on project implementation in Peru, which I match to novel administrative data and spatial data to construct a panel data set of districts spanning 2005 and 2015, which is the time of the National Sanitation Plan in Peru that made a nationwide push to expand access to sewerage systems. And what I do to go around endogenous placement of projects is using an instrumental variable strategy, exploiting geographical features as a source of variation for project implementation. So the data I use is budgetary reports for 6,000 projects. I am able to identify the year of start and completion of a project if it's ever completed based on disbursements from financial reports. And what I do is I construct a cumulative number of implemented projects per district and year. But I restrict the sample of analysis to the district years before at least one project was completed in a given district. So essentially the counterfactual scenario is no projects implemented versus implementing projects. To construct the infant and under 5 mortality rates, I use vital statistics and population forecasts. And then what I do is I also rely on grid cell level spatial data, specifically for geographic features that are unique in affecting sewerage projects. And I'm able to compute the share of the district that falls in these different geographic categories. I rely on census, municipal characteristics, and sectoral public expenditure to evaluate a bit more the mechanisms, as well as do some robustness checks. So I have a panel data of 1,379 districts for every year spanning 2005 and 2015. Okay, so you might be wondering how can districts be accumulating implemented projects? And essentially that happens because the rate of completion was very low. So by 2015, only 1/5 of the started projects were completed. And what generated this variation over time is that essentially there is a lot of variation on the years that a project takes to be completed. So that essentially the years that projects are implemented. And what I'm showing in this graph on the x-axis is the years projects are implemented, and on the y-axis, the share of projects. So essentially what we're having here is a proof that there are many delays caused by projects being halted. So you can see that the histograms for projects that were ever halted is shifted towards the right, while the histogram for those that were never halted is shifted towards the left. And the blue dotted line can show that the average time that a project that was never halted was 2.7 years, while the average time that a project was implemented for one that experienced at least 1 year of halting was 4.3 years. So essentially, what we're observing here is that delays are being caused by halting projects, and also there is a mid-construction abandonment. So we have to consider these implemented projects as those experiencing faulting implementation. And this faulty implementation of infrastructure is not typical only in Peru. It has also been highlighted in the literature. So this graph here motivates essentially the whole focus of the paper. What I'm showing here on the x-axis is the year relative to the year of completion K of a given project, keeping only for this descriptive graph the sample of projects that were ever completed. And then I'm matching that to the district level mortality, which is shown here on the y-axis, essentially as a residual of a district and year fixed effect. And the y-axis is specifically showing the under 5 mortality rate relative to the completion year for each of the years. So essentially, how much was the mortality rate for years 5 and 3 before the project of completion minus the mortality rate of the year of completion. And what we can observe here is that the mortality rate during 5 to 3 years before the project of completion was higher by 0.3 deaths, and 1 and 2 years before the completion is higher by 0.13 deaths. So essentially what it's important to take up here is the fact that this mortality that is higher before completion is the one that is related to health and safety hazards. So essentially infectious diseases, waterborne diseases, nutritional deficiencies, as well as accidents, which are the ones that could be linked to the implementation of these sewerage projects. We do not observe that the mortality is higher before the year of project completion for any other unrelated causes such as non-communicable diseases and congenital malformations. Now, in line with the literature, there is ample literature showing that sewer systems were effective at reducing early life mortality. We can see that after a project is completed, the mortality is actually lower. Now, I cannot claim that these estimates or these statistics are causal, because the timing for project completion as well for project start is endogenous in this case of Peru. But what this is showing is a little bit of a notion that something is going on during this implementation phase. We know that on average districts projects are taking 5 years to be completed. And the whole point in the rest of the presentation will be to show you how I'm able to identify a causal estimate of this implementation phase on mortality. So what I do to go around the endogenous implementation of sewerage projects is to rely on an instrumental variable. And I essentially use a counterfactual implementation of projects based on cost. So I exploit the fact that a unique combination of geography, so essentially low elevation, steep gradient, and water flows, so a high river density, are affecting the district's suitability for low-cost sewerage projects. Now, this is going to give me a cross-sectional ranking of districts in terms of their suitability. But in order to generate time-varying predicted projects, what I do is that for every year, the counterfactual will implement projects for each district starting at the top of the ranking until the nationwide budget available for sewerage is exhausted. And then it's going to continue doing the same for the next year. So there are going to be some discontinuities that are going to be generated by the fact that this nationwide budget is going to be changing over time. And a second restriction that is imposed in this counterfactual implementation is just the maximum threshold allocation. So essentially, once a district hits 5 predicted projects, it's going to open up capacity to allocate projects to other districts that have not been intervened yet, given this counterfactual implementation. So that's essentially generating more variation over time across projects, across districts, sorry. Now, the identification assumption is that no other demand-side factors, policies, or infrastructure evolve over time following exactly the same spatial lines. So this is a comparison of the actual and the predicted SIGRAN implementation in Peru. And we can see that there is some over allocation when we consider demand side factors in the relatively wealthier north coast of Peru compared to the, sorry about that, compared to the actual, comparing the actual with the prediction. Okay, so I'm going to have a panel data model with district and year fixed effects. MR is the mortality rate. SDT is the number of implemented projects. The sample, as I said before, is the district years before project implementation. And the counterfactual scenario is no project being implemented. So I'm going to try to go fast through the results. I show here that the instrument is relevant, so the predicted projects are actually associated with the actual implemented projects. I run a placebo test in which we can see that predicted projects are not associated with mortality, infant and under 5 mortality in columns 2 and 3 before the start of projects in a given district. And then columns 6 and 7 are going to show essentially the main result of the paper, which is that implemented projects can kill. So I find that for every additional implemented project per year, there's an increase in infant mortality rates by 0.003 deaths and by 0.625 under 5 deaths per 1,000 under 5 infants, which both of them translate into a 17% and 13% respectively over the initial means. Now, you might be wondering a little bit about the mechanisms, although I think that picture that I showed at the beginning clarify a lot what's going on. But I'm gonna focus essentially on showing you now, for the interest of time, what's happening, the mortality by cause of death. So you can see here that while infant mortality, essentially, the whole effect is driven by waterborne diseases. And we have to consider that infants in Peru, many of them are actually not exclusively breastfed during their first year. So they are taking contaminated water because of this detrimental environment. Now, for slightly, when we include slightly older children, we can see that both the effects are driven by under 5 mortality rate caused by waterborne diseases as well as accidents. And we have to consider that there are these large building sites are diverging traffic chaotically, and also these open ditches are generating pools in which children can drown and can fall. And actually that has been documented in the newspapers. So other types of mechanisms that are taking place here is that there are water cuts and that people are forced to rely on unsafe sources of drinking water for as well as affecting their sanitation practices. So this is also explaining why infant mortality is increasing in these districts. And I also test alternative channels and none of them hold. So I have to rush here, but just as a conclusion is that implemented projects are increasing infant mortality rates and under 5 mortality rates, and halting projects can double this effect as they create 2 extra years of delays. Now, the main takeaway here is not, well, let's not construct sewerage, but essentially is the fact that ignoring the social cost during the project implementation can lead to overestimates of a cost-benefit ratio. And the social benefits, of course, once these projects are completed, which are well documented in the literature, will never manifest if projects are not completed. And I have found that by 2015, around 40% of the projects were halted and we were not able to observe their completion. So if these projects are just completely abandoned forever, this is also a wasteful use of public resources, as these not completed projects had already 40% of the contractual sum disbursed, which in total is equivalent to a waste that is the same as 1/3 of the public expenditure on tertiary education in 2015 in Peru. So this is just the back of the envelope calculation. So you get an idea of the really, really high opportunity cost of these funds. So thank you very much. And I look forward to your comments and questions. I think we're already over the time of the session, but it was a really, really interesting session. Yes, Mateo.
Hi, yes, I have 2 questions. I'll try to make them quick because both of them are kind of clarifying more than trying to make a comment or something. But the first one is, if you can tell us a little bit more about what are the sources of endogeneity that you are worried about, because when I saw the picture, the one that you have the residualized things with the before completed, after completed, I thought that was super compelling. And so I'm kind of curious about where do you think the difference between the OLS and the two-stage estimator is coming from, because it's quite large. And I thought it was kind of compelling, just the OLS. And that's the first one. And the second one is if you can clarify then the source or is the effect on one extra year of a project that goes uncompleted, or one extra project that goes uncompleted? How to understand the magnitude? Also, because it's, I maybe you have it and couldn't show it, but it's like you can have maybe some counts of, or some back of the envelope calculation on how much projects run over their estimated time and how many extra deaths those are coming from. I don't know, kind of like gains from efficiency, not in cost size, but in kind of health, life size. But overall, super interesting things.
Thank you, Mateo. I think these are really, really relevant questions. So to address the first one is the fact that, okay, so the picture that I showed essentially is giving you the time, is showing you before and after the time to completion. But what you would really need to focus on is before and after the time of starting of a project to be able to prove pre-trends. So the reason I'm not using an event study is because the time to starting a project was not random. So richer municipalities and with better socioeconomic, let's say, variables like a lower share of their population with unmet basic needs were the ones that were more likely to start these projects, and they also follow different trends in mortality over time. So essentially the OLS estimates are picking these differential trends by these relatively richer districts that were the one that were starting more projects and earlier on. And that's why there's a need. In the paper, there's a bit of more discussion about that. I had to skip that part about endogeneity, but that's why it makes it a bit tricky to use an event study in that sense. Also because, essentially projects are repeated within a district and the mortality rate is measured at the district level. So I would need to look at the time before the start of the very first project in a district, and that we know is not random. I think you had another question of how to interpret the results. So because it's a count that never decreases, it's always increasing. The way to interpret the result is for every additional project per year. So if there's no change in an additional project started, then it means it's just an additional year that these projects are being implemented. And then your final question about, I think it was about, it would be super interesting to look at actual delays. The problem is that between 2005 and 2015, the government of Peru was not registering the expected time that a project will be completed. So essentially the graph that I showed was a way of motivating how projects can be completed faster if they are not halted. So essentially we can interpret that as a delay if you're halting a project. So essentially there are delays. New data that I have for a new project on public works now from 2015 onwards have the planned time, the planned duration. So it's essentially way better to measure now delays, but unfortunately back then it was not possible. Thank you. So I think Cesar also has a question.
Hi, Antonella. Excellent paper. I really enjoy it. I was wondering why you do have mortality data on children only, or do you have the mortality data on all the population? Because, because I will think that you will also convince better if you show that there's not increasing mortality for other population because they are not so vulnerable to this kind of water contamination shocks. Right? So I was wondering if you did that too.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So the data that I have right now, it's only for early life, and it was essentially the outcome that changes because of sewerage projects as expected. But as you say, the data on later years mortality can be used as a placebo. So I can try to get that data. I think that would be nice. But what I have right now is kind of alternative mechanism. Besides the fact that I'm focusing on causes of death that are unrelated to these projects, like as a placebo, I'm also checking at like migration and selective migration and trying to see if there was kind of a change in, for example, the share of the household heads that have education. And maybe what happened was that these works were so disruptive that the relatively well-off left the district, and then we were left with the poorest. But actually, I find the opposite. I find that if anything, there's kind of a positive effect on the share of those that have a household head educated, which seems to be the case that infrastructure projects may be attracting actually households that expect to connect to the sewer systems, but that is not a channel that is explaining this increase in mortality. But yeah, thanks for your comment. I'll try to add the placebo test as well. Yes, Roman.
Antonella, I have a question. I don't know if this is going to be like useful, but I was wondering if you have thought of looking at long-term effects of these unfinished projects. I don't know if, for example, the kids that were affected by these seawash projects in the phase implementation, like if they attend less to school or if they have some size problems or things like that, if you have thought about incorporating these elements, I don't know, in another paper or something like that.
Yes, thank you, Roman. Yes, definitely. This is opening scope for a big research agenda to try to understand in general how the infrastructure projects during the implementation phase can be affecting other sort of outcomes. A little bit related to my comments before when I was telling you like how long the expansions of the subways were taking and how that can create disruptions. In this case, something that in the long run, as you will say, that can affect is the fact that even survivor children could be affected in the long run because they were exposed to more waterborne diseases when they were young. That's a way in which we would think that on the long run, we can see that it decreases, let's say, cognitive development or performance in schools. On the other hand, we may also have a selection effect. So actually the weakest children died and we are left with the strongest ones that survived. And we may also see that actually things improve just because of scarring actually versus selection effect there. So yeah, but these are interesting things that I would love to evaluate further. So yeah, it's good to know that there is interest. Okay, so we are definitely over the time allocated to our session. I think like, yeah, by 10 minutes, but it was great. I'm really happy to see that the audience was really engaged. I think there were lots of really interesting presentations, and please do get in touch via our emails. And yeah, if you have more questions, if you have more comments, we'll be happy to stay in touch.
All right, thank you, everyone. See you.
Thank you, everybody. Hope to see you
guys.
at some point.